Right, good evening from Istanbul. This is Dr. Simla Doğangün, and I'd like to welcome you all to the World Literature webinar series. And I'm very much pleased and honored to welcome you to today's webinar. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Sharae Deckard. Welcome, Dr. Deckard. Dr. Deckard serves as an associate professor in world literature at University College Dublin, where her research explores the intersections of environmental criticism, world systems analysis, and the study of world literature, ecology, and culture. With Upamanyam Pablo Mukherjee, she is the academic series editor of Paul Graves' New Comparisons in World Literature series, and she is also on the editorial board for Liverpool Studies in Literature and the Environment. Dr. Deckard is also the director of the UCD Environmental Humanities Research Strand and a member of the Environmental Humanities Steering Group for the Irish Humanities Alliance. Dr. Deckard's publications include a monograph titled Paradise Discourse, Imperialism and Globalization, published by Routledge in 2010, and Combined and Uneven Development Towards a New Theory of World Literature, co-authored with the Warwick Research Collective and published by Liverpool University Press in 2015. Dr. Deckard's editorial contributions include the volume Marxism, Postcolonial Theory, and the Future of Critical Engagements with Benita Perry, co-edited with Rashmi Varma and published by Routledge in 2018. Additionally, she collaborated with Stephen Shapiro as the editor of World Literature, Neoliberalism, and the Culture of Discontent, published by Paul Graves in 2019, which was honored with the BACLS Edited Collection Prize. Her forthcoming book, Tracking Capital, World Systems, World Ecology, World Culture, co-authored with Michael Niblett and Stephen Shapiro, is slated for publication for SUNY Press in March 2024. Dr. Sharae Deckard has served as an editor for 5 special journal issues: Food, Energy, Climate, Irish Culture and World Ecology with Lindsey Collen for the Irish University Review in 2019, Experimental Writing and the Globalizing World with Wendy Knepper for Ariel in 2016, Ireland in the World System with Aidan Beatty and Maurice Coakley for the Journal of World Systems Research in 2016, Global and Postcolonial Ecologies, which included an editorial introduction, Reading the World Ecology for Green Letters in 2012, and Postcolonial Studies and World Literature with James Graham and Michael Niblett for the Journal of Postcolonial Writing in 2012. Additionally, Social Reproduction, Feminism and World Culture, co-edited with Kate Holden, is forthcoming in Feminist Theory in spring 2024. She has also published multiple articles on postcolonial eco-criticism and world ecology in journals, including Interventions, JPW, MLQ, CLC, Atlantic Studies, Green Letters, Moving Worlds, and various edited collections, companions, and handbooks. She is currently editing a Routledge Companion to Literature and Environment. She has a particular interest in questions of genre, including peripheral realism, critical realism, eco-Gothic and eco-horror, weird fiction, and postcolonial science fiction, and sci-fi. So today, and this evening, let's say, the title of Dr. Sharae Deckard's presentation is Capitalism's Long Spiral, World Literature, Periodicity, and the Neoliberal World System. In this lecture, Dr. Deckard will examine representations of the long spiral of historical change and the periodicity of capitalist crisis and anti-capitalist resistance in contemporary world literary texts, approaching world literature through the methodological frameworks of the Warwick Research Collective as literature of the world system. She will suggest that the aesthetics of globalist literary texts from core-hegemonic situations, such as David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas or Simon Ing's Dead Water, which accompany paralyzing neoliberal conceptions of empty time or determinist causality, should be read as symptomatic of neoliberalism's crisis of futurity, even as their images of bad totality attempt to figure the periodic phases of capitalist accumulation over the world system's longue durée. In contrast, she contends that counter-hegemonic works of world literature generated in proximity to political struggle deploy formal strategies insistent on the possibility of apprehending the uneven synchronicity of time-space sensoriums produced by uneven and combined development and anti-capitalist resistance in semi-peripheral situations. Using examples from Rita Wong, Lindsey Collen, and Subcomandante Marcos, she demonstrates how counter-hegemonic texts evoke the periodicity of capitalist crisis and of revolution, but evade the pitfalls of false universality and determinism, attempting to revitalize the possibilities for positive freedom through struggle in the present. So to make the most of our time together, we kindly request your active participation, and please feel free to ask your questions by typing them in the chat box. Following Dr. Deckard's presentation, we will do our best to address them. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharae Deckard. Dr. Sharae Deckard, the floor is yours, and let me start.
Thanks so much, Simla. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone turning out, which I know is a late time for some people, depending on your time zone. Okay, let me just share my slides. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. Whoops, one sec. There we are. Okay. In his 2001 Roads of Dignity speech, Zapatista insurgent Subcomandante Marcos criticizes the dominant discourse of capitalist temporality offered by neoliberal ideologues. For Marcos, neoliberal presentism is not so much an existential crisis of temporality in which all contemporary subjects are mired, trapped in the post-political sensorium of the long present neoliberal moment, in which all sense of time and history seems to have been annihilated by the global integration of the capitalist market. Rather, the symptoms of a crisis in temporality, that is, quote, a turn towards the past whose final horizon is the present today, these days, the fleeting instant, are caused both discursively by ideology and culture and materially by the violent efforts of imperialist and capitalist states to repress revolutionary alternatives, as in the case of the Mexican state's attempts to destroy the EZLN's autonomy in Chiapas, Mexico. And Marcos writes, neoliberalism, which is nothing but a fad, that is, a turn towards the past with the horizon of the present, conceives of the world as the only one possible, as the culminating product of time, and its intellectuals and image promoters shoot the clock of history in order to stop time, and in order thus to ensure that there won't be any morning other than the one of today over which they preside. This is neoliberalism as a long social and economic project, not per se an inability on the behalf of intellectuals to imagine historical change that could bring about a different futurity, but rather a concerted effort to repress those imaginative possibilities in their political and cultural expressions, to eradicate the very prospect of alternative cognitions in social organizations, and to reorganize life worlds for the economic and political benefits of elites. Rather than diagnosing the contemporary era as universally or inescapably afflicted with a paralysis of the temporal imagination, Marcos goes on to emphasize the collective agency of the Zapatistas whose, quote, struggle for dignity aims to get the clock of humanity running again, and in so doing unlocks a temporal vantage in which, quote, a similar turn is taken towards the past, but, and this is fundamental, the final horizon is the future. He concludes by offering conjoining images of the revitalization of historical action with metaphors of reading. We, the indigenous peoples, have resorted to the art of reading that which has not yet been written. By our struggle, we read the future that was planted yesterday, that is cultivated today, and that can only be harvested if we struggle, that is, if we dream. In this talk, I want to take up this call to read the intimations of the future somewhat literally by examining representations of the temporality of historical change and the crisis and anti-capitalist resistance in contemporary world literature. My conception in this paper of the literature of the neoliberal world system follows my own work with the Warwick Research Collective's proposition that the analytic category of world literature with a hyphen designates, quote, a single but radically uneven world system, a singular modernity, combined and uneven, and a literature that variously registers this combined unevenness in both its form and its content to reveal itself as, properly speaking, world literature. but with the added understanding that any literature of the capitalist world system must also be literature of the Capitalocene, Jason W. Moore's term to designate the geological era dominated by the organization of nature society within what he calls the capitalist world ecology. As such, I take a critical approach to world literature that aggregates a world historical perspective of the nested temporalities of capitalism's durées and cycles, what I'm going to call capitalism's long spiral after Stephen Shapiro, a world ecological conceptualization of capitalism as not only world economy, but also as constituted by and through ecological regimes, and a world literary practice attentive to the aesthetic mediation of both combined and uneven development and the hierarchical differentiation of the world system between cores, semi-peripheries, and peripheries. Crucially, this constellation of world literary methodologies aims to move beyond merely nation-based criticism to comparison of multiple literary units that are located not only in different spaces, but in different temporal units of capitalism's longue durée, with modernity of the world system acting as what Nicholas. However, such an approach must not be so over-determining of interstate competition and the temporal cycles that shape the world system that it excludes analysis of modes of resistance from love or to the forms of culture can both call into being or challenge different accumulation regimes by stabilizing or destabilizing the realignment of class formations and alliances. To the contrary, by rigorously periodizing capitalism's accumulation regimes and restoring the repressed horizon of its long duration, world literary criticism can usefully teach us about aspects of neoliberalism that economics and political journalism cannot or may not, exploring the particular experience systems, rationalities, bodily dispositions, socio-ecological regimes, cultural genres and forms, or modes of political resistance that mediate processes of neoliberalization, as well as the ways in which cultural forms register, imagine, or make history from below. Contemporary world literature is riddled with literary expressions of a crisis in temporal representation, symptomatic of the aesthetic mediation of reactionary neoliberal discourses of the global contemporary as a timeless, homogeneous present, mired in the instantaneity of affect. However, it also abounds with counterexamples of critical aesthetics that mediate temporal sensoriums of the contemporary as profoundly uneven and heterogeneous, structured by the asymmetries of capitalist development and underdevelopment. In many of these latter examples, history is narrativized as synchronic and multi-temporal. While neoliberalism likes to present itself as a post-political global consensus, it is certainly not received as such by those in struggle against the myriad forms of social and environmental violence unleashed by capitalist accumulation. So too is the sense of empty, homogeneous time promulgated by its ideologues quite differently experienced by subjects subordinated to different constitutions of labor in the peripheries or semi-peripheries of the world system. Therefore, it is unsurprising that globes are far from universal in their negotiation of the problems of temporality in narrating world history. While those which mediate elite metropolitan or hegemonic perspectives often embody paralyzing or facilely celebratory neoliberal conceptions of the empty time of the global, in those which foreground the necessity of narrating history from below, from the perspective of concerted life situations and struggles for dignity, the lineaments of the capitalist world system and the intimations of futurity can be apprehended much more distinctly. I suggest that the aesthetics that embody paralyzing neoliberal conceptions of what poet Jeff Dirksen has called annihilated time and overemphasize the spectacle of reification, eroding the capacity for autonomy, could be read as symptomatic. In contrast, I contend that counter-hegemonic works of world literature, whose critically conscious registration is generated in proximity to struggle, often deploy formal strategies insistent on the possibility of at least apprehending the uneven synchronicity of time-space sensoriums produced by both capitalist development and anti-capitalist insurgency. These texts evoke the periodicity of capitalist crisis and of counter-hegemonic revolution, but evade the pitfalls of false universality and determinism in their attributions of causality, attempting to revitalize the possibilities for positive freedom through historical action and struggle in the present. Their sense of the present is often saturated with apprehension of a signal crisis of neoliberal capitalism, marked by the ecological and economic exhaustion of the current developmental phase of accumulation, and a corresponding sense of a crisis of US core hegemony. They imagine the contemporary as a spectrum that may or may not be a transit point to some new mode of production, but which is certainly no actual end of history. All right, so I want to actually turn to thinking a little bit about the text in greater detail. Rendering the simultaneity of the complex relationships that constitute the world historical totality of global capitalism across multiple temporal and geographical scales presents challenges of legibility to narrative and form. Within globalist varieties of fiction that could be said to embody core-hegemonic perspectives of globalization, often set in northern capitalist cores, but that nonetheless try to move beyond the narrow sliver of individual experience to encompass or represent the global. The strategies invented to negotiate scale and simultaneity are often circumscribed by a failure to identify capitalism's totalizing force, offering instead a vision of false universality. Maximalist fictions of this variety that try to replicate temporal simultaneity or multifocality at the level of sentence or paragraph often result in exploded, nearly unreadable novels. Similarly, encyclopedic fictions or total novels which attempt to reproduce totality within themselves often run into the Borgesian paradox of producing bloated texts as big as the world itself. Meanwhile, linear chronological approaches to world history risk degenerating into schematic lists of events, dates, and puppet-like characters, like, to give one example, Jorge Volpi's trilogy of the 20th century. The world historical ambit of Season of Ash, Volpi's trilogy's concluding novel, set in the contemporary era, dizzyingly takes in Chernobyl, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Mexican debt crisis, the imposition of IMF structural adjustment programs in the Congo, the bulldozing of Rachel Corrie in Gaza, the rise of the anti-globalization movement, the ascendancy of neoliberal economic policy, and the commoditization of new molecular frontiers via the mapping of the human genome, but succumbs to what I would call a Wikipedia-like accretion of thinly delineated events. This is what you might think of as what Brodel famously called the history of events, a superstructure-heavy conception of history as a metronomic procession of facts, events, and instants, in which social change is presented as determined solely by the top-down actions of key political elites and agents who are depicted in the novel as themselves in thrall to a Dawkins-esque genetic determinism, driven by their, quote, greedy, savage genes to perpetual competition, end quote. As one character laments repeatedly, quote, why do humans always want more? Why are we always simultaneously greedy and insatiable? Volpi's novel excoriates the application of shock therapy across the global south, particularly in Mexico, but attributes the violence of structural adjustment to the failures of individual actors, policies, and great leaders, or to the genomic condition of the human, understood as a biological fact, rather than to the systemic logic of capitalism, in which neoliberalism is only one historical phase. Collective possibility or resistance is barely intimated, since while the plot encompasses a global horizon in its charting of the geopolitical ascendancy of capitalism after the collapse of the USSR, its narcissistic characters are relentlessly trapped within their individual middle class or elite perspectives, allowing for no consciousness of the world system as such. The one leftist character is a kind of straw woman lifestyle activist who is portrayed as capriciously flitting from cause to cause due to an Electra complex rooted in defiance of her patriarchal conservative father. The insurgent possibility of imagining an alternative future, thus psychologized and dismissed as adolescent female rebellion. In the end, Volpe's vision of the contemporary is a paralyzing image of the ascendancy of neoliberal capital as an end without an exit. And the strain of narrating so many events across so many territories produces mutilated flat characters who function more like mechanisms and subjects. The trilogy, however, for all that I've said, is an interesting failure. It heralds the contemporary proliferation of global literatures that attempt to move past the nation, to take the world itself as their operative totality of representation, their ultimate horizon, while exemplifying at the same time the twin perils of form, which totalizing aesthetics often encounter. That is, the ideological pitfalls of determinism, false universality, and political paralysis, and the formal dangers of mechanistic plots, flat characterization, or reductive psychologization. The clunky literalness of the literal lists of oil prices, commodity rates, dates, and GDPs that litter seasons of ash. Recall Leroy Medavoy's useful reminder that world systemic literary criticism looks not for literature that maps, quote, the scales and coordinates of the globe as might a chart of gross domestic products, oil consumption rates, or ballistic missiles, all of which are literally listed in the novel. There's these constant sort of lists of what the GDP of a nation currently is. But rather for what Medavoy calls for, an attention to writing that, quote, maps the dynamics of the system as an interplay of subject and object, power and desire, force and affect, as they are propelled by the spatial dialectics of territory and capital. The particular hallmark of worldliness for Medavoy's analysis is the capacity of contemporary world literature to evolve narrative forms that exceed the national horizon and capture the polygonal multi-scalar relations of the uneven exchanges that striate the globe, but without sacrificing complex conceptions of subjectivity, power, or agency. These kinds of fictions would take capitalism as a universal baseline, a universality utterly striated by asymmetries. By contrast, many contemporary globalist novels that embody core hegemonic perspectives bluntly set out to erase difference or asymmetry in order to gain access to the world literary market, radically simplifying their linguistic particularity, cultural specificity, and aesthetic complexity. And I'm thinking here of Tim Parks writing about global novels and the kind of politics of translation, which some authors practice, not all, in order to remove obstacles to international comprehension. When he talks about writing in a kind of standardized, easily translated language that will translate into what he calls global English. In more formally experimental varieties of the globalist novel, erasure of asymmetry and difference produced by capitalism often emerges from the tension between the nomothetic and the ideographic. These novels struggle to generate universalizing laws or explanations for totality when they do not acknowledge the capitalist world system as that which could provide the nomothetic baseline for comparison. At the same time, they tend to flatten out the ideographic particularities of different periods, geographies, and cultural and social formations, shaped by the dynamics of combined and uneven development, in favor of aesthetic mediations that emphasize uniformity over asymmetry. In inventing versions of universal laws that they imagine humanity as a whole to be subjected to, their aesthetics mediate the systemic totality of neoliberal capitalism, but in a mystified form that emphasizes its drive to uniformity over its inequities, what Stephen Johnson has called the compelling logic of standardization that is projected onto the world order itself as the general logic of globalization. That is, their images of universality tend to be reified symptoms of, rather than critical explanations of, the structural causality of neoliberal capitalism. Thus, to give two examples that I want to look at a little bit more, transnational network novels such as David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas or Simon Ing's Dead Water move effortlessly from one geographical or temporal setting to another, hopping in both time and space and blithely swapping genres as they go, treating historical periods and the genres that emerged in them as a set of interchangeable units to be shuffled in an interminable cosmopolitan present. These hyper-connected novels are significant and that they set out to imagine the globe, but lack a critical consciousness of the structural interrelations of the world system. Their conception of homogeneous time is symptomatic rather than diagnostic of their inability to imagine a post-capitalist future. The illusion of total commensurability integral to their form unconsciously registers the time-space imminent to what Jason Moore has called neoliberal financialization's, quote, extraordinary project to commensurate all of reality into generic income streams that can be standardized and exchanged effortlessly. If these kinds of novels reject eventist notions of history as a diachronic timeline proceeding linearly towards progress, that is the old kind of hoary myth of time's relentless arrow, they are still faced with the problem of syntactical conjunction, of trying to suture together the disparate historical moments, heterogeneous experiences of time, and multiple determinations that constitute the singular modernity of the world system into one single narrative. As Nicholas Brown has written, the problem of history, with a capital H, for literature is of how to find a narrative form capable of assembling, quote, multiple and in themselves disparate temporalities, that of the earth, of institutions, of individual actions, in Brodel's version, into a followable narrative. This problem of narrative totalization is too frequently resolved via plots that rely on deterministic, even fatalistic conceptions of causality and universality, in which human autonomy and agency, the history which emerges through concerted life situations, the human making of the future, is erased, or in which the agency of extra-human nature, the temporalities and exertions of biophysical and geophysical forces, is attributed an anthropomorphized causality. These reified images of false universality act as a kind of screen image, which rather than functioning as a rich hieroglyphic giving insight into multiple determinations, instead flattens and condenses them into a unidimensional picture. Furthermore, these condensations are frequently projections of the structures of feeling pertaining to particular elite or bourgeois metropolitan class within post-Fordist capitalist cores in the North, permeated with anxious fears of a crisis of hegemony of American, British, or European centers, which itself might indicate a larger epochal crisis of capitalism itself. In Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, for instance, hierarchical relations of exploitation perpetually return to oppress the characters in every period, posited as a universally human condition, thereby denying the historical particularity of the different stages of capitalism's development, from, say, the kind of high imperialism of the 19th century to the neoliberal present. The novel metatextually references its own nested structure of six tales through a physicist's description of his model of time as an infinite matryoshka doll of painted moments, each shell, the present, encased inside a nest of shells, previous presents. In one sense, the novel's treatment of world history as infinite recursion, in which we, quote, we crisscross and recross our old tracks like figure skaters. So all the novels, the characters and different things kind of repeat, and there's motifs and repeating tropes that happen in every period that the novel is set in every different genre that it's written in. These signal a distorted apprehension of the systemic periodicity of capitalist crisis and an anxiety around the cyclical rise and fall of core hegemons, in which recurrent crisis is reified as inevitable and eternal. Sorry, I put my slides out of order, so I had to flick back. Periodicity, the quality or character of being periodic, the tendency to recur at intervals, is a concept useful to world literary critics, and it might be opposed to periodization, which is a more linear understanding, or an evolutionary one, where we think one thing follows the other and evolves into the next, and it doesn't go backwards, as opposed to something which is intervallic, which recurs, which comes back, which isn't necessarily a straight linear line. Periodicity is a useful concept because it enables us to move beyond horizontal analysis of genre production to vertical synchronic comparison of the rhythmic ways in which literary modes, genres, and forms might emerge and recur at different phases of the long waves of capital accumulation. Stephen Shapiro has argued that the history of capital's constitution as an internal processional of recurring economic cycles that differ in their dominant form and geography of social intercourse, but not in their fundamentals, could be understood not as a two-dimensional flat cycle. Everything just kind of goes around and around in circles and is exactly the same, no matter where it is in that cycle, but rather as a three-dimensional long spiral, which repeats earlier processes and kind of goes around and has features that are the same, but are different in every new sort of spiral iteration. And in which these earlier processes are repeated, but in newly expanded, innovative or forms, along with the emergence of completely new characteristics. Writers at similar moments of the spiral might thus look to older literary forms and genres which manifest similar dynamics and seek to renovate and reactivate them in order to provide a conceptual and aesthetic framework for the present, even as they change the genre and aesthetics to speak to new conditions. A world literary approach to periodicity and the figure of the long spiral as itself an image of history thus provide new ways of explaining analogies and continuities in chronically contiguous periods, but must be predicated as analytical, that is, as explaining the appearance of recurrences of similarities rather than deterministically predictive, that is, not assuming that they must always appear. So it's not schematic in that sense. As such, world literary critics could read the nomothetic tendencies of capitalism's long spiral in dialectical tension with the ideographic particularities of cultural manifestations at different points of the spiral. Applying this to the problem of the contemporary, instead of treating the aesthetics of literary representations in the neoliberal era as somehow wholly exceptional, unlike anything we've ever seen before, we might instead periodize them in relation to texts from earlier historical moments in which financialization was ascendant, as well as seek to detect the ways in which the time-space sensoriums corresponding to lived experience of those crises might be registered in their form, whether critically or unconsciously. However, I'm also interested in how periodicity as critical lens and motif enables the reading of literary mediations of capitalism's own periodicity as subject, as in Cloud Atlas, a text that's symptomatic of the kind of mystified or flattened apprehension of periodicity, as opposed to the counter-hegemonic text that I want to conclude the talk by discussing, in which the periodicity of capitalist crisis is situated alongside a recuperation of multiple historical moments of unrest and resistance, synchronic contexts across a diachronic durée, which emphasize the collective agency and capacity of humans to change history and create different futures. In these latter texts, periodicity is not conceived in determinist terms as a cycle that's always doomed to repeat, nor is recurrence presented as always the same. However, in the first variety, the kind of more determinist kind, such as Cloud Atlas, periodicity is mystified as an eternal recurrence of the same, as when the character Frobisher in the novel describes his view of history, contrary to official versions that emphasize heroic teleologies of linear progress, as the repetition of cycles of decline and fall, which he calls indelible truths played on Nietzsche's gramophone record. Quote, Rome will decline and fall again, Cortez will lay Tenochtitlan to waste again, and later Ewing will sail again, Nietzsche's gramophone record, when it ends, the old one plays it again. The novel strains to assemble different conjunctures and historical durées into one narrative, but its vision of the periodicity of the rise and then fall of multiple imperial hegemons, so, we have Rome, we have Mexico falling to the Spanish Empire. We then had the British Empire, and then later its fall, and then the rise of America in the text. This kind of view of the rise and fall over the longue durée is flattened and one-dimensional, presented as the repetition of a finite number of states within an infinite number of time. The text projects its own distorcized conception of post-Fordist subjectivity, the structure of feeling of a declining core Britain, riven by its own post-imperial melancholia and confronted by climate crisis in the text, backwards across time as universal human nature, and the famous kind of slogan of the text, quote, souls cross ages like clouds cross skies. So there's this sort of notion of soul hopping and dematerialized jumping across different periods. This is even if the novel's form moves beyond its thematic content and juxtaposing a future setting with its array of historical moments, interpolating science fiction alongside assembly of other nostalgic genres, the imperialist romance, the crime fiction, the noir, etc. This genre assembly is another form of flattened periodicity, which approaches the problem of narrative totalization by assembling genres which each correspond with different times into one formal structure, but does so in a way which emphasizes their seeming interchangeability rather than the determinate relations of different times which might have given rise to them in the first place. In a typical instance on dialectical recuperation of the utopian prospects of literary form, and even the most unlikely places, Frederick Jameson has celebrated Cloud Atlas's formal construction as a successful instance of what he calls totalizing retrospect, that, quote, stages our own present as historical by diminishing it to a passing stage between nostalgia pasts and a science fictional far future, that is the kind of apocalyptic far future section of the text, juxtaposed with the sort of nostalgic accounts of the 19th century and so forth, kind of acts as a kind of retrospect that makes history of the present, Jameson says. However, this selection of Cloud Atlas by Jameson as exemplary seems somewhat perverse, given the abundance of actual utopian texts from post-colonial and semi-peripheral settings that combine the far future and the historical to more powerful effect, as in the examples from Lindsey Collen and Rita Wong that I want to move towards later. The two imagined futures of Cloud Atlas itself are respectively dystopian and apocalyptic, governed by a green Malthusian conception of the inevitability of environmental and social collapse, a thoroughly determinist vision of the doomed present. Similarly, the novel's formal construction, governed by a logic of interchangeable and eternal recurrence, might be read as a correlative to the ascendancy of financialization under neoliberal capitalism, embodying globalist discourses that breathlessly imagine the fluid, weightless, lightning-fast exchanges of commodities and information across the planet, the collapse of all of space-time into the one time of the market. Simon Ings's Dead Water, the next kind of novel that I want to look at, another sort of globalist, somewhat determinist fiction, is more attentive to what Alan Sekula and Noel Birch have famously called the slow industrial time of globalization, rather than the fantasy of the weightless velocity of exchange and informational capitalism that's encapsulated in the symbolic logic of Cloud Atlas's formal construction. In the notes to their film, The Forgotten Space, which is about the sort of the shipping industry and containerization, Sekula and Birch argue that critical accounts of neoliberalism and deindustrialized capitalist cores often overemphasize the symptomatic affects and subjectivities of post-Fordism, neglecting to examine the uneven industrialization of new spaces, including the sea itself, where the revolutions of containerization and just-in-time delivery mean that, quote, the factory system is no longer concentrated in the developed world and dispersed, in which factories themselves begin to resemble ships, stealing away stealthily in the night, restlessly searching for ever cheaper labor, and the function of the ship is akin to that of conveyor systems within the old integrated car factory. Parts span the whole world on their journey to some final assembly line. From its first page, Ings's novel, Dead Water, announces shipping containerization as its central subject, offering the industrial restructuring of ocean-going sea train around containerized cargo handling since the 1950s as a key portal into the infrastructure of the neoliberal economy. Quote, the world goes round and round, packed, palletized, boxed, numbered, turned to paper, turned to figures, turned to logic gates and light, to symbols we will never grasp and concepts that evaporate as soon as they are spoken. Why the weather will not die, why the waters will not stop in their courses, why the winds will not cease to blow. The somewhat peculiar conjoining in this passage of elemental nature of biophysical forces with that of extreme rationalization telegraphs the neoliberal vision of what Jason Moore has called abstract social nature, that is, quote, the production of nature as something to be mapped, rationalized, quantified, and above all, controlled in ways that ease the endless accumulation of capital. However, as we see above, the novel peculiarly attributes a deterministic agency to technological revolutions, that it conflates with the laws of so-called nature in a way that curiously exceeds the agency of its human protagonists. The novel extrapolates from the symptomatic logic of extreme rationalization a false conception of historical causality rooted in an ontological
Can you hear us, Sharae?
Yes, I can hear you. Have I cut out?
Yes, but now you're back.
Okay. How long was I out?
It's like 5 seconds or something.
Okay, yeah, I don't know why. I'm not seeing any problems with my ping, but I'll try and continue. But if it cuts out again, just interrupt me again, please, and let me know.
Okay, I will.
Anyway, okay, so the novel kind of, I was saying, extrapolates from the symptomatic logic of extreme rationalization in the neoliberal era, a false conception of historical causality that's rooted in the ontological conviction of the impossibility of all individual agency, expressed in its distortion of the scientific theory of cavitation that determines the sort of circulation of oceanic currents into a social law determining human history. The novel's epigraph telegraphs this ideological embrace of determinism by citing a letter from the American historian Henry Adams, in which he elaborates his philosophy of nature and society, saying, "My philosophy teaches me that the laws which govern animated beings, that is, human beings, will ultimately found to be at bottom the same with those which rule inanimate nature." So it kind of takes things like the theory of cavitation and uses it to kind of explain social developments rather than to explain precisely the kind of the ways in which oceanic currents work, or it uses kind of atmospheric understandings of the ways that clouds moved, again, to kind of predict human movements. Like the green Malthusianism that suffuses David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, this curious overdetermination in dead water of non-human nature is in one respect another interesting failure in representing totality, which attempts to deconstruct the sovereignty of the human individual and to resist anthropocentrism, and instead grasp the totality of human history in tandem with the activity of extra-human nature, to make what Jason Moore calls the world ecology its object of representation. However, in its actual execution, it annihilates the prospect of both individual or collective human agency. Instead of grasping the world ecology as a totality of relations in motion, it offers a historical misapprehension of extra-human nature as a fixed and static collective of obdurate matters, objects, and laws that rule indiscriminately over humans and without change. This undialectical view simply reverses the nature-cultural binary to imagine the eternal rule of objects over subjects rather than subjects over objects, offering a false causality rather than representing the complex interrelation of human and extra-human relations in the co-production of nature. Throughout the novel, characters struggle for self-determination over and over, but are perpetually obstructed by influences that they cannot discern, circulated like so many containers through dead water, quote, their every forward impulse also a return, and their efforts like, quote, so many perturbations that disrupt an ideal frictionless fluid, causing them to churn uneasily like so many stalled propellers. So this kind of ongoing metaphorization of containerization to imagine humans themselves as like the containers being shipped about. Doomed to futile and non-productive struggle against inhuman forces which are as unyielding as the ocean currents, they are denied precisely the agnoneuresis or recognition of global realities from the conditions of their own struggle that is necessary to any political imagination able to conceive of futurity. Instead, to give just one example, in the crime genre portion of the narrative that's set in India, Rupa Vish, who is a police detective turned private investigator, is physically brutalized and assaulted again and again on her voyage across horrific geographies of corruption and social violence, as if to punish her for a masochistic belief in the possibility of social transformation. So that she concludes, away from the Anti-Corruption Bureau and its loving realities, she has been dreaming up a heroic role for herself. A female detective alone across the system, a city cop hacking her way through rural corruption. But what in the end has she uncovered? While Rupa is plagued by the sense of a nearly incomprehensible deception being carried out, she eventually capitulates to a sense of determinism and, quote, learns to look upon herself as a machine by the end of the narrative. In the neoliberal accumulation regime, the labor that produces the goods transported through the world via containerization is always seemingly somewhere else, perpetually relocated to reassignable sites in capital's ceaseless quest for cheap wages. The boxes are everywhere, mobile and anonymous, their contents hidden from review. One could say that these containers are, in Sekula and Birch's words, coffins of remote labor power, carrying goods manufactured somewhere else by invisible workers on the other side of the globe. Rupa investigates the secret of bodies buried in a shipping container as it moves around the world, trying to uncover the conspiracy that underlies it. But trapped within her own reification, she is never allowed in the novel's narrative to discern the secret at the heart of the novel, that the local mafia's violence in her particular city is actually connected to a larger transnational corporation's secret shipping line that circulates toxic waste and biochemical weapons outside of national jurisdictions using containers. So at the level of the kind of narrative, we're able to perceive what she can. But every single sort of individual character in the narrative is never able to kind of have any recognition of the truth of the larger system as it's being manifested in their sort of local particulars. Because they are no longer proximate or contiguous, sites of commodity production are no longer accessible through the realist rhetorical devices of metonymy in the same way, except through what Sekula calls some great imaginative geographical leap, the uncanny ability to wear Nike sneakers and jump in the imagination to an assembly line in Indonesia. In Dead Water, this formal problem of metonymy is negotiated by the creation of a supernatural perspective outside of the realist narrative conventions elsewhere in the novel. So outside of, for example, the detective conventions of ratiocination and detection that are sort of implicit to the noir section that Rupa is the protagonist of. Tellingly, the only characters capable of perceiving the whole in the novel are not the detectives or spies of the crime and thriller sections, but rather the deceased twin jinn spirits of two orphans. After their death in a train wreck, they are given a privileged insight into capital's disasters deriving from their capacity to circulate anywhere on the planet through the conductors, wires, and pipes of globalization's infrastructure. The looped infinity symbol is their sigil, appearing as a motif throughout their magical realist sections, which punctuate and stitch together the narrative, as well as printed next to the page number on every page of the novel. So it's both a visual motif and a textual one. The twin spirits circulate through time and history in the form of an Ouroboros, concealed inside of one of the secret containers, dematerialized, weightless souls outside the bounds of the otherwise realist and material narrative. Quote, they are literally disembodied, interpenetrating clouds of pink steam, a nova seen double through a gravitational lens. Vaporous, expanding constantly, the twins flow through new conductors, play demolition derby round the looped infinity of a pair of spectacle frames. In contrast to this post-human comprehension, which elicits neither empathy nor the possibility of solidarity, the living, embodied characters of the narrative are perpetually denied consciousness of the systemic forces impacting them, and the possibility of social detection or cognitive mapping for collective political ends is consistently foreclosed. There is no concerted life situation from which the human protagonist can apprehend the larger system, no way to break the infinity loop of capital's endless circulation. all capacity for subjective understanding is displaced into the magical realist portion of the narrative. The spirit of history, recompartmentalized within strict generic divides that accentuate the hegemonic perception of an immovable, predetermined present. Okay, but the final section of my paper. What of contemporary world literature that invokes a counter-hegemonic perception of temporality, which seeks to apprehend but also to change the course of history? In the spirit of my opening quotation from Marcos, which emphasizes the centrality of struggle to the very capacity to read the future that was planted yesterday, I want to conclude by gesturing to examples in contemporary texts that attempt to dream the future and revivify the imagination of historical transformation, rather than over-determining the political paralysis of human agents in the present. The first takes the form of a more fully realized and utopian example of totalizing retrospect in the novel, motivated by the explicit desire to revolt against the colonization of the future, as demonstrated in Lindsey Collen's There is a Tide, whose science fictional frame narrative, set in 2050 after a worldwide socialist revolution called Create, presents the novel as a found object, a series of testimonial narratives from 20th century Mauritians assigned as a curricular text in post-capitalist society. From this vantage in the future, the so-called found object of the text is dialectically presented as both a cautionary image of a capitalist society trapped in mindlessness, but also an insurrectionary history of anti-colonial and anti-capitalist resistance in the forms of multiple periods. Firstly, the independence strike, then the strike actions of 1971, 1975, and 1979 in Mauritius, as well as other forms of dissent, both collective and individualized, from the mass fainting of women sweatshop workers used as a factory slowdown, to the arson of cane workers and sugar plantations, to the hunger strike of an adolescent girl, and finally the dancing of a mother in front of the police as she calls revolution. These different forms of revolution and resistance interlace specific historical contexts of institutionalized left organization with individualized and more momentary acts of resistance, thus assembling a punctuated history of, quote, the deep anger of generations interspersed with moments of open, proud rebellion. These moments are not portrayed as doomed, fatalistic, or interchangeable, but rather as punctuated accretive advances in which each generation recuperates and builds on the knowledge of earlier struggles. The novel opposes two motives of the cyclone, of the cyclone that invoke spiral periodicity. The first is its image of capitalism like, quote, a cyclone turning round and round uselessly, embodying a similar hegemonic perception to the two texts we've seen earlier of capitalism cycles as somehow inevitable, the bad or flattened periodicity of endless or fruitless repetition, a false universality evoked through their anthropomorphization of meteorological forces. For the text, this cyclone signifies a society trapped in mindlessness, spinning in the contradictions beyond which they cannot imagine. However, the turning of the cyclone is also invoked by characters in the context of the return of moments of historical opportunity when social conditions are ripe and the imagination of genuinely revolutionary alternatives becomes possible again. Thus, the frame narrator contrasts the dominant perception of capitalism's immutability or seeming cyclicality with a properly historicized perspective that emerges from the concerted life situation of those struggling, quote, right in the middle of the cyclone. People at the time thought that all the effects of the cyclone were more or less inevitable. Some thought it the work of the hand of a bad-tempered god. Others thought it the work of an indifferent nature. But Coco B. Panchu is a kind of metafictional writer within the text, questioned the cyclone and its meaning. In contrast to the apocalyptic futures and interchangeable paths of Cloud Atlas, There is a Tide is invested in the goal of revitalizing the capacity of the reader, even in the face of multiple defeats of moments of class, race, and gendered insurgency in the neoliberal present of the novel. It's still trying to imagine a post-capitalist future in which revolution actually succeeds in generating a better global society, and to recuperate memory of a history riven with asymmetries and constituted through class struggle. The former of the novel finds a way to narrativize temporal levels as manifolds not only of subjective and transgenerational socio-historical time, but of the temporalities of geophysical and biophysical processes of the objective natural world, that is the cyclonic time of seasons and meteorology, the time of the earth, so that the movement of history is not reduced to some idea of eternal nature, but rather imagined as emerging from the active struggle of humans within the material conditions of extra-human nature. In literary aesthetics, particularly within many post-colonial literatures, the slow unfolding and prophetic time of the spiral is often a temporal figure that refuses both eventist versions of history as linear time's arrow and the determinist periodicity of the infinity's closed loop, instead emphasizing the ideographic particularity of rebellion against the nomothetic tendencies of capitalism's cycles. My concluding example is Rita Wong's poem, Remembering the Future, in her collection Undercurrent, which interpolates a citation from Rebecca Solnit's essay on the significance of the spiral snail shell, or caracole, adopted by the Zapatistas as a symbol of both their revolution and of their modes of horizontalist governance. The revolution spirals outward and backwards, away from some of the colossal mistakes of capitalism's savage alienation, industrialism's regimentation, and towards old ways and small things. It also spirals inward via new words and new thoughts. I should have said that Wong is a Chinese-Canadian poet. She ends the citation there, but in the original essay, Solnit emphasizes that the revolutionary spiral has two directions. The astonishing force of the Zapatistas and their revolution has come from their being both deeply rooted in the past and prophetic of the half-born otherworld in which, as they say, many worlds are possible. They travel both ways on the spiral. Revolutionary time for the Zapatistas spirals into the future in their famous phrase, lento pero avanzo, that is slowly yet still advancing. So the snail is often an image of this inching forward, carrying its spiral shell on its back. In this spirit, Wong's collection, both in its form, some of her poems are literally written in spirals, but also in its motifs, repeatedly summons the idea of a poetics that spirals into futurity while being rooted in long memory of the past, that makes history of the bad present through political struggle and imagination. Whether in Remembering the Future or when she asserts in another poem in the collection, quote, we commit to live up to the future's call. We are wet premonition, ferocious spirit waiting for the master's dams to crack, vigilant survivors of neoliberal snake pits. Her collection presents water itself as a critical nexus through which to offer a devastating critique of the hydropolitics of the capitalist world ecology's devastation and commodification of the watersheds, rivers, and oceans of the planet, but also a utopian recuperation of the possibilities of water democracy, something which is wholly absent from Simon Ings's Dead Waters kind of portrayal of the seas as being utterly ruled by containerization, which imagines instead how different relations and interdependencies that are enacted through water could be both individually and socially embodied. Unlike dead water, hydrological cycles are not instrumentalized as metaphors of social laws that imagine human activity as doomed to circular repetition or overdetermined by biophysical processes. Instead, the poems offer potent images of hydrological flows and riverine circularity as life-giving potential models for socio-ecological relations in which people live together in interdependence and reciprocity rather than hierarchy and exploitation. Instead of fatalistic determinism, Wong's poetry foregrounds the agency of indigenous and collective organization in contesting capitalist nature in the contemporary moment, chronicling instances of resistance against diamond mines, uranium extraction, tar sands fracking, land dispossession, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, big dam construction, and exhorting we have to stand together in many places all at once, whether, quote, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, who she references multiple times, or the Super Barrio, the Mohawks, the Ki, the Lei-Lin-Yin. Wong's collection concludes with a poetic form of totalizing retrospect. So I gave one example from Collen in fictional form, and here's one example of totalizing retrospect in poetic form. Her concluding poem entitled Epilogue, Letter Sent Back in Time from 2115, which begins, "Here is wonder despite armies of mistakes," depicting a post-capitalist world in which water, waste, and food are all differently conceived and no longer commodified, in which property ownership and commodity relations are a thing of the past, in which serious play enters work, and indigenous resurgence slows climate instability and deflates apocalyptic fervor. This is not a perfect future, nor a static return to some imagined pastoral past, since climatic instability is depicted as only slowed, not reversed, and systems are still, quote unquote, collapsing as new social relations sprout and emerge. But it is a present in which temporality is no longer conceived through the lens of apocalyptic paralysis or stasis, but rather as changing and dynamic, and as infused with the syntax of hope. And with that image of hope, I will finally conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me for, allowing us to read these novels in a different, very, very innovative lens. As I was reading, perhaps if there are other people other than me who want to ask questions before I do. If you want, you can also switch on your microphones and pose your questions. Perhaps I could just start by asking mine, because I was actually thinking about the Cloud Atlas the first time I read it, and I was kind of struck by the blurb that actually was saying, it was written as, let me find it. It was like, David Mitchell erases the boundaries of language, genre, and time to offer a meditation on humanity's dangerous will to power and where it may lead us. Now, it really made me think about this this spirality that you were actually referring to. So, and the other novels, I am not very much familiar with them, but this one completely resonated with me. I wonder how you just think about these blurbs at the same time with these novels. Do they have anything to adapt to this, this perspective?
Well, I think that blurb is interesting because it both kind of encapsulates what I'm saying about the novel, that it is about constantly collapsing boundaries in a way that is profoundly dehistoricizing, but was positioned as being cosmopolitan and universal in a good way. Those are slightly different things. I know cosmopolitanism and universality. So that in itself is kind of interesting. And this notion of it being all humanity's dangerous will to power, again, this kind of invocation of a certain Nietzschean concept of being doomed to this, rather than thinking about the actual social economic structures through which power is sort of embodied and accreted, through which forms of hierarchy and exploitation emerge. It kind of makes it seem timeless, like everyone's doomed because there's always going to be a savage grasping for power. It's not entirely dissimilar for why I would also critique discourses of the Anthropocene, as many have, for just kind of positing a notion of an undifferentiated anthropos. All of humanity, all of humans are all to blame for climate change. Well, what about our specific kind of structuring of a still kind of colonial, still capitalist world? What about the kind of, the particular power relations and geopolitical relations that mean that some elites are kind of responsible, a tiny handful, for far more sort of carbon pollution than the whole of the global South? Like, those sort of inequities aren't captured in a figure of all humanity is doomed to produce violence or crisis. And it also doesn't have any kind of alternative conception of power. But it's also interesting because it's a book blurb. It's about the marketing of the text. I didn't talk about the literary market in my paper, partly because I don't work primarily on kind of questions of market reception, consecration, dissemination. But obviously, those are very important for the global novel form or for kind of global literature that is setting out to represent the global. It often is sold in particular ways, as in the kind of the case of the two Anglophone global texts that I'm talking about here, that posit themselves as global and are sold as having a certain kind of insight into all of humanity, but one that is actually profoundly like lacking, even for all that they have settings in multiple locations around the world, including colonies and post-colonies, seems to have any real kind of lack of any awareness of the particularities and conditions of life in settings outside of the metropolitan thing, and is instead projecting these sort of representations onto them. And I think that does raise interesting questions about why certain forms of representation of the planetary or the global or the cosmopolitan, or what the universal is, or what humanity can be understood as, and how we understand planetary crises, such as things like financial crises or climate emergency, how certain kinds of texts might be more marketable than others or sold in particular ways, and ones that might produce very sort of either comfortable or symptomatic sort of understandings of what's really happening, which is why I'm interested in the kind of counter-hegemonic ones too. And Ings's and Mitchell's novels both have won tons of prizes. They were bestsellers, especially Cloud Atlas. There's an absolutely terrible film made of Cloud Atlas too. It's pretty horrific, and what it does with race is also incredibly dodgy in terms of complete erasure of racial specificity in the casting. But the latter texts I talked of are actually, are much smaller and harder to find and difficult to sort of access, partly because of market conditions. Like Collen's work frequently goes out of print, even though I think she's an extraordinary novelist. Mauritius itself, as a kind of place of literary production, is one that is kind of somewhat occluded in relation to, say, other perhaps like regional places in Southern Africa. And Rita Wong is a poet, so she is a well-known poet, but poetry doesn't perhaps have the same circulation power as the novel form does. So yeah, the question of the book blurb does raise kind of secondary questions about the market and what Bourdieu would call the literary field, and the ways in which novels and genres and particular ideologies that are sort of embodied in the form of those genres and forms might circulate more, like with more kind of rapidity and recognition in some contexts than the others. Often.
Can you hear us?
It might be similar. Yeah, Adriana, I can see you raising your hand, so
Okay.
I just call on you.
Thank you. Hello, Professor Deckard. I'm a big fan of yours. I come from Romania. I put down a lot of notes after your excellent presentation today. I have two very short, basic questions that came up to my mind. One regards your emphasis on the problem of narrative totalization and the way that this narrative totalization plays the game of neoliberalism by resorting to a false causality, to a determinism which erases human agency. So I was wondering, do you see in these terms human agency as being counter-hegemonic? And why, considering that wouldn't forefronting human agency also play the game of, also fall in the trap of the very neoliberal myth of individuation and of individual agency. Individual agency is also a very public myth, forcefully constructed by neoliberalism. So I fail to see the entire counter-hegemonic potential of human agency as long as it is forefronted in the narrative. My My second question, I think it's shorter. Um, um, do you see awareness of the world system as being as depending rather on the narrative form, on the literary form per se, or do you see it as a condition of the structural location within the world system? So it depends on the literary form through which we see it, through which we have this awareness, or it depends on the specific place within this world system from which we regard it. Because your last examples, I wasn't familiar with the last examples you mentioned, but I felt they were built in the exploded form you mentioned at the beginning. They were written in testimonial and very fragmented forms. So those would be my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Those are both
Thank you.
really great questions that go to the heart of some of the things I was trying to talk about. So the first question, the problem of agency. Yeah, like I wouldn't want to in any way like over celebrate particularly neoliberal conceptions of human individualism, and not just neoliberal, like obviously liberal conceptions of human individualism, and particularly the kind of, you know, whether it's homo economicus or the individual consuming subject, or the ideas of the individual that they just work harder, they will achieve something. I mean, I think to a certain extent, the texts that I was sort of critiquing for their determinism are particularly interested in a kind of like, they're symptomatic in the sense that they are reflecting this overdetermination of that figure, but also in a way the sort of impossibility of the figure, the falseness of the fact that if you are invested in the notion of the individual as achieving everything, and you're not acknowledging the actual class relations or structural and systemic relations, and you're not acknowledging to the extent to which that very notion of the individual is itself discursively produced by a system that is invested in sort of offering a false idea of freedom, then you're going to end up with a very problematic idea. I still think there's a difference, though, between the notion of like between saying I reject that kind of false image, and between kind of insisting on the capacity of individuals to at least be able to perceive and apprehend the larger coordinates of their own sort of situation, particularly from within situations, as I was sort of saying, concerted struggle, or when they are experiencing exploitation. It's one thing to reject a neoliberal version of agency. It's another thing to say that humans can't have any sort of individual or subjective capacity to act in the world, to make things happen, and to have a political consciousness or a social political consciousness of why and where they are in the world and what is happening to them. And what I think is that second kind of a sort of less bad agency, we might think of it, rather than that kind of very discursive ideological neoliberal variety of it, is completely absent in the kind of more hegemonic text that I was talking about, to the extent that even characters that might want to be resisting something, it's not shown that it's because the system is so big they can't resist it. It's because individuals can't act at all, because they're doomed, as both those texts keep saying, to repeating cycles of violence. There's a kind of fatalistic notion of the impossibility of all human endeavor, except for those in power who will always get more power, which is like a really shit version of history. Like, as bad as things might be right now, we can look back and go, hey, the Haitian Revolution happened. Hey, the Mexican Revolution happened. Hey, the French Revolution happened. Hey, general strikes happened and brought new things into being. Independence movements, anti-colonial movements, in which individuals had consciousness of their particular historical moment, but also came together in political collectivities. And that would be the second issue, the kind of the notion of collectivity, of an individual having consciousness, but then also being able to join in and organize and become part of a larger collective organized subject that exceeds the individual. That collectivity is central to the last text that I talked to about, as well as the Zapatista kind of text. I cut some of the stuff out from that, but it's completely absent. There is no collectivity whatsoever. And in a way, collective agency is the answer to the limits of the individual. Although I would still say that we need to have an emancipatory imagination of the human individual, where there is a kind of possibility of the true freedom that we do not have right now, but that we can still strive to. So like there's a complete absence of even the ability of why things are happening. Like every single character is often failed, or there is, like in the very first text I talked about, the Mexican novelist Jorge Volpi, there's a kind of insistence that it's only the elites, it's only presidents, it's only the technocrats and the IMF, it's only the big actors and the kind of superstructures of the world that can do things. But of course, that's also a bad version of it, that only that kind of elite version of great people in history make things happen. So that's also a kind of, I'm sort of interested in thinking of like bad agency, bad causality, bad universality versus more kind of productive conceptions. In terms of the second point, what the kind of, there's kind of two questions around the world system, perception of it and registration of it. Within text, and whether or not that's thematized at the level of content, or whether or not it's a question of how the form speaks to it, and whether or not that's specifically a product of location, or it's more to do with form and genre. Well, first of all, like the kind of rec line would be that all literature is literature of the world system. Therefore, even if a text does not set out to consciously represent the system, it's not setting out to write a global novel, it's not setting out to write an epic poem of the Capitalism, it's not setting out to invent an experimental form to try to represent all of planetarity as that kind of operative totality up here of the whole thing, which the texts I've been talking about today are mostly, they are often looking towards that global level of representation, but I could have talked about others. They will nonetheless still be produced within the world system wherever they are, and mediate and respond to the conditions from which they're reproduced, sometimes critically and consciously and as a matter of form for sort of formal innovation. Other times it might be through their very absences that they're revealing something about the conditions under which they're produced. Now, I don't want to have a kind of overly schematic notion of like texts that come from this location will be better than texts from this location, but I do think there is something to say about texts which kind of embody more kind of hegemonic and core and metropolitan or bourgeois perspectives, often are perhaps more saturated both with the ideologies of that particular social formation, and more likely to draw on certain forms and aesthetics in which those ideologies are embodied. If we think of forms as sort of abstracts of social relations, and having something that they tend to kind of encapsulate certain kinds of things that you have to push hard against if you want to kind of use them for other purposes. Whereas often texts that are arising specifically out of something like a liberation struggle, or Lindsey Collen's novel was written during a general strike in Mauritius and a prison mutiny, but is also informed by the longer history of various forms of insurrection in the book. And she has constant scenes where she sort of zooms out from these super local struggles to the larger context of US imperialism, the dispossession of the Chagos Islanders, the setting up of privatized prisons in Mauritius by the US for profit, as well as the old colonial forms. In that text, there is something about emerging both within the locations of the political struggle, but also different traditions of understanding and representation. There's a lot of folklore in the text. There's a lot of mobilization of kind of oral history as well as literary traditions that is kind of speaking to the particularities of Mauritian society. And those things, I would argue, are kind of partly semi-peripheral in the sense that they're kind of emerging from a different cultural and social formation. That's not to say that any text from Mauritius will have to register those things and be critically conscious or be leftist or be revolutionary. It's not to say that any text from New York is necessarily going to always be, or London in the case of Mitchell and Ings, is going to be a kind of bland world mapping text without consciousness. But I do think there is still something, that question about what's mediated is partly informed by those things. And the final point I would make is that within the kind of world systems vocabulary we use, we don't kind of reduce it to just a geographical location. There's a kind of sense of internal scales of cores and peripheries. So to go back, I keep saying New York, but Istanbul or Paris or London. These are kind of big core cities of their countries. They're metropolitan, and they're going to have, like they'll have middle class and upper class sections and have highly advanced places, but there will also be peripheral sections of the city, just as there are more peripheralized parts of the country at different degrees. And people writing about the life experiences and struggles that might emerge out, not in the kind of core parts of that city or the core parts of a country, might often have a different sort of material, a different sort of to be abstracted into literary form that might give a certain different consciousness or capacity. But finally, all that said, I do think different forms do have limitations, and there's often a kind of struggle against those limitations in the kinds of texts I was talking about today. And I find them all interesting and how they struggle with and negotiate with them, sometimes failing, sometimes staging the problem of form as a kind of imminent critique within the novel itself. And it's more likely the ones that are arising from those more kind of conditions of struggle that actually put the critique of the formal limitations within the text itself, rather than kind of holding the form up as, I've done the thing, I've mapped the planet, look at this amazing text, isn't it sort of extraordinary? I'm not sure if that's a very good answer, because like those are two, I think, very important questions that are kind of wrestling with things. But just to say, I don't want to be reductive and say that any text written in one location in the so-called periphery as some static geographical thing is necessarily going to have a certain kind of expression, and a text from another place, I don't think that's true at all. And that's not what I'm trying to argue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stan, for your question. And thank you, Dr. Deckard, for this very comprehensive response. And I also see another question on the chat box, if we could just read this one as well. Anna Kirsch, she writes, I really enjoyed the talk. There is quite a bit to digest, and I hope the recording will be available. I was quite struck with the portion on periodization, but I didn't quite catch the word for the counterforce for the master narrative the process of periodization presents. I was hoping you might elaborate more on the long spiral in relation to the emergence of genre. That's something that I was also thinking about.
Yeah, and I was like, in a way, I didn't really do that much. I ended up talking more about like kind of the world mapping novels in a way. I think the question of genre is a really interesting one in relation to like periodicity, understood not as a closed circle, but as a kind of spiral where things might emerge at different moments in different time. Something that like a lot of people, including Kirsten was on this call, but I think she's had to leave, another collaborator of mine, and Stephen Shapiro and others have written about, is particularly how things like speculative genres, for example, like the Gothic, often, or maybe horror, or kind of narratives that often to kind of rely on a kind of a notion of crisis or something from the past erupting in the present. It's very interesting to look and see how kind of clusters of Gothic actually emerge in literary locations, often at different points in time, in response to kind of large-scale socioeconomic crises, a kind of sense often that the old order is rotten and needs to collapse, and that a new one is emerging, but that new one is being contested, and it might go a really bad way, or it might go a good way. So it's really interesting, to kind of look and see why you might see sort of clusters periodically emerging of a certain kind of approach, but they're different every time. It's not as if it looks exactly the same. There's often a sense of writers sort of looking at earlier moments and going, well, this text seems to be able to respond to the kind of problems that I'm trying to articulate now, and then kind of reactivating that form to speak to it. So like, we kind of talked a lot about, for example, some of the work that we've done has been on something like Lovecraft. And if you look at the original Lovecraft, like, it's quite racist. H.P. Lovecraft is sort of riven with fears of like descending in a primitive past. And it's written sort of in those 20s and 30s moments when there is this sense of, first of all, a massive economic recession looming and then arriving. It's written at the moment of like the kind of imperial decline of the UK kind of looming and of the world wars. But it's also this moment when there's a vast beginning contestation by the colonized world, the kind of the rise of the first kind of anti-colonial and pan-African sort of discourses, the rise of socialist and labor movements and the general strikes of the 30s. And you could kind of read his Gothic fictions, which are very kind of, again, like very reactionary in many ways, as like registering this immense fear of the collapse of a certain moment, of being haunted by the sense of like the past is going to collapse, or the violence that has been committed in the past is going to re-erupt into the future. But if you compare those to like kind of neo-Lovecraftian texts that emerge in other locations, like particularly say in like Latin America and Caribbean at the moment, a lot of the rewritings that are being done of Lovecraft are kind of dwelling on that same sense of epochal world crisis, like this sense of the 30s as this like haunted decade where fascism and socialism and forces are warring it out, and kind of reactivating that to think about the current moment, again, as this sort of like conjunctural moment where there's like immense crisis, immense violence. There is this huge rise of right-wing and authoritarian movements, but there's also, there's indigenous movements, there's feminist movements, there's anti-capitalist movements of various kinds, all, and anti, sort of climate strikes, all trying to contest the reality we have. And this gets reworked within the kind of, that sort of Gothic or weird fiction as an expression of the sense of something collapsing, but also something coming into being, but not yet there. And there's almost a sense that there's a kind of formal repository of a sort of toolkit of representation that can be reconfigured. So I'm very interested in that notion of how we might think of periodicity, both of capitalism itself and its crises, which come back often magnified and worse in new form every time they come back, because like the spatial fixes that have like displaced them, or the ways that they've been sort of contained, have just been magnified and they come back to haunt the present. That's very well suited to something like Gothic, which is about hunting. But I'm very interested in how like periodicity might be both represented as a subject within texts like those I was talking about, but also how it might inform our understanding of things like genre itself and the ways that they travel, that don't always travel in linear ways, especially if we don't follow a national kind of conception of, this is realism, and then modernism arises, and then magical realism arises, and it's linear and it goes like this. What about why things arise in different periods and different geographical locations in different moments that often look quite similar, even though they're across time and space? Periodicity can account for that in a way that periodization doesn't. So that's kind of what we were doing with that sort of notion.
Yeah,
I think there's a question from Tara now.
Yeah. Let me read it for all of us. Tara writes, a wonderful talk and Q&A. I met Sharae at St. Andrews years ago for World Lit and Dissent Conference. Regarding genre and determination paralysis, do you sense a tragic tone in the more cosmopolitan novels you read, or attempts to adapt tragedy as a way to articulate paralysis and lack of human agency under neoliberal capitalism or financialization? Thank you.
That's an
Thank you
interesting
for
question
question.
too, and almost one I wish I could throw back to you, Tara, because I'd be interested to see whether you're thinking of particular examples. Yeah. Are you thinking of particular examples of like tragedy that you would see as doing that work?
Well, of course, this comes from my own work. I also wanted to say merhaba to the Turkish. My husband and I were at Bill Kent for several years.
Oh, really?
So I just wanted to say hello. So I was thinking about the focus on cycles, and I'm looking at Orwell in particular, and Burmese Days, and I'm trying to understand what I think is this like adaptation of a very almost classic type of tragic trajectory. And I know you mentioned the narrative of the detective woman who is trying to have this heroic journey. I'm also thinking about the ideological work that these novels do just in terms of a compensation for a bourgeois reader, right? Who feels themselves located in, either in this capitalist system, is not politically engaged, and gets to read these sort of encyclopedic grand narratives that kind of supplement lack of activity and relieve the political conscience in a way that says, no, it's not possible for you to act. We are all trapped. So in a way, and if these novels generate a type of sympathy that for this position, so I guess I'm thinking of some of the affective and ideological work, and if the tragic tone at all is utilized or tapped into.
Yeah, I think you put that much better than I could have, like that notion of compensation for a bourgeois readership, and why that might be particularly like when I was sort of blundering around trying to talk about market conditions, like that particular kind of readership might be very invested in that. And, I was thinking too about something that like David Koenig said about why Bolaño became a bestseller, like a while back, and he said it's because there's a sense of like the average kind of like middle class city dweller in North America yearning for some sort of encyclopedic consciousness that can narrate the whole of the planet for them, but without having to do the work themselves. And I think that there is something about that exactly, and that there's a pleasure in that that avoids, like, yes, I can't do anything. They're all doomed, and especially these subjects that are represented in these narratives, like the Indian character or the character in the Pacific, or the indigenous person, that are represented as being doomed. They can't do anything. Well, I can't help them. I don't have to have solidarity for them. I can have a tragic sympathy for them. So I can have feelings. I can have sentiment. I wonder if it's not so far away in some ways. I mean, you are looking at kind of like that earlier period, that still imperialist period, but that kind of that appeal. I'm really taking someone else's point here. I was just reading a 5.0 last week on the literature of internationalism, but it was looking at kind of like the kind of texts that appeal to a notion of the international by Joseph Williams. And he was kind of arguing, Joe, that there's these, in the kind of imperial moment, particularly that late imperial, like early 1900s moment, where there's often this evocation in sentimental terms of like the suffering subjects of empire in multiple locations, that really just kind of like is still reifying them, not imagining them as capable, the colonized, of having collective agency, which is appealing to sentiment and melancholy sort of affects to make the readers feel better or feel that they're doing something. So it's not actually a true internationalism as it's conceived, or it's still deeply racialized and classed in various ways. And I think maybe something is going on there with what you're doing with Orwell and Burmese Days. I think that's really interesting. In terms of tragedy, sometimes, yes, the tragic thing of like Oedipus, we're all trying to do the thing, but we're doomed to repeat the bad
or just the idea of fate.
Fate as being something, it's so weird to resurrect fate in contemporary fiction. Like, why? It just seems so antiquated in some ways. But fate is like a bad cipher for the actual causality of like the systemic forces that we're trapped in, which do make us feel helpless, do make us feel bad. But like, let's think about fate instead, because it's more romantic. It's linked into a particular literary or a cultural tradition, particularly say in the West, the kind of the particular mobilization of that. It's weird to me too how sometimes like almost Spenglerian discourses are coming back. It was like, we're back to decline and fall, really?
Yes.
But I really think that's also part of a certain kind of post-imperial structure or feeling that emerges from places like Britain or the US or Western European, I should say, anxieties around its kind of power and position in the world, and a sense of that hegemony still being there, but threatened, increasingly having to be bolstered by extreme forms of militarization and violence rather than being able to be achieved through soft power. And I think that in a way that these texts are capturing that structure of feeling through that kind of invocation. But the tragedy is it's more than even tragedy. It tends to be more like kind of like fatalism, I think. You know, it's more, and determinism, not even a sense of like the heroic tragic fate that almost gilds the person who goes through it, and through that we can achieve catharsis and then think about how to reorganize society, or think about the implication of justice if we're reading Sophocles or whatever. It's more, it's not tragedy even as cautionary tale, but as this is just this inescapable thing. It's not, oh, see what Macbeth did, he shouldn't have chosen power, that was bad, but isn't he interesting as a figure? There's almost like the emptying out of the interests of the figures, because they're just like little flattened cogs and machines just squirreling around, at least in the sort of text that I was describing. Like literally Rupa says, I've decided to become a machine because that's all I am. So there's a complete relinquishing of that sort of heroic, but perhaps tragic, you know, leaning over into tragic status, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
But it's a really, really interesting question.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. Great talk.
Yeah,
it's really nice to see you again. It's been ages, so thanks for coming.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. If we don't have any particular questions, perhaps it's time that we bring this session of our World Literature webinar series to a close. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Sharae Deckard, our distinguished speaker here, for this insightful exploration, and to everyone here in the audience for your engaging participation. And your contributions have really made this discussion not only enlightening, but also, I think, reflective of the collaborative spirit of Warwick Research Collective, which has been actually working on this idea for quite some time. And thank you all for being a part of this very enriching experience for me, I would say. Thank you, and I wish you all a very good evening, good night.
Thank you so much, everyone. Fantastic questions, really, really useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.